Hey, readers and writers, I'm Adrian Buskey, and this is Fictitious, a show about the storytelling craft of science fiction and fantasy. Greta Kelly is the author of the Warrior Witch duology, including The Frozen Crown and The Seventh Queen. Her latest fantasy novel, The Queen of Days, takes readers to a canal-crossed island city where the people pay service to their many gods of myth, even as science advances with pistols and airships. Balthazar leads a small family of thieves called the Talion, all orphans from a bloody political upheaval that stripped them of title, dignity, and loved ones. Bal has a score to settle with the governor who stole everything from him, so when a mysterious benefactor offers him riches to pull off a ludicrously daring heist that includes an opportunity for ultimate revenge, Bal cannot refuse. The catch? His crew must hire a masked mercenary known as the Queen of Days to be the linchpin of their operation. But the Queen's service carries a heavy price, one Bal lays on the shoulders of his contentious family without consulting them. One last job, that's what Bal tells himself, their one chance to live free and comfortable and to overthrow the man who ruined their lives. But as they infiltrate the public christening of a new temple, they discover the governor's plans are even more ambitious and insidious than they could have imagined, and that the gods of old are much closer than they think and hungry to conquer. The Talion will face an impossible choice: abandon their city and people to escape an oncoming disaster, or throw themselves into the face of annihilation in the war between God and man. With the Queen of Days by their side, they just might have a chance, if they can accept her true nature and connection to the enemy. The Book of Days is breakneck-paced fantasy adventure coming October 24th from Harper Voyager. And Greta Kelly, welcome back to Fictitious.
Thank you so much for having me. That description was so good. I'm just going to hire you to follow me around for the rest of time.
I just had Matt Wallace on the show, and he was like, I want you to be my Bard Herald at all events from now on. Just come out and do the opening
got
spiel.
The adventuring party already set.
Right. Yeah, I am totally the Bard of the group. So yes, absolutely. And that actually makes me pinpoint something that I want to talk to you about a little bit later on, which is some of your adventures outside of authordom, because I think it all ties into the author journey. So we started talking about this before we got the recording going, but I was really psyched as I brought Fictitious back to have you back on the show. One, because I really had a great chat with you when we talked, I think it was like at the end of 2020 before the world went super crazy. It already was kind of nuts. But as you were about to bring out The Frozen Crown, the first book in that duology, the Warrior Witch duology. So when I saw you had a new book coming out, I was like, okay, this is perfect. This is really good timing, because I think it's really interesting for me, and hopefully the audience too, to step back in here and go, okay, now it's been essentially 3 years since that time period, and you were a debut author then. This is your third book coming out now over the course of 3 years, which is crazy pants. And so I'm really interested to kind of find out what that author journey was for you, all the things that you've been doing. I mean, I've been following you on social media all this time, so I know that you have been plenty busy in many, many ways over the course of all this. But before we get really deep into that side of the story, let's talk more about the Queen of Days. I just gave my 300 words of description. What's your author elevator pitch for it?
So much shorter, but I usually pitch The Queen of Days as being about a crew of thieves who team up with a time-eating demon to steal this ancient statue from their city's governor before it can be used to resurrect a vengeful god. And when that fails, it'll be up to them to put down the god and save the city. Or not, because, chaos.
That is very pithy and strong, and I think stronger than all of my words. And I forgot to bring up the time-eating element of it, because that's an interesting part of all of that as well.
Yeah.
So, but we'll get to that. To a certain extent, like, I thought of it as sort of like Firefly in a fantasy world.
Oh my God, exactly. I love that show, yeah.
Yeah, there was something about, we talk about found family a lot as like a trope that is really prevalent in a lot of fiction right now, and for good reason. And this is an instance where it's kind of found family, except for four of the people are related, so they're actual family. But their circumstance has made them tighter than maybe they would have been otherwise, and certainly has changed their lives a lot. And we'll talk more about the Talion and like what that means as a group. But yeah, like I think that's kind of how I would pitch it to people, where it's like, I saw people make references to like Six of Crows and some other books I had not read, and I'm like, oh, if you took Six of Crows and combine it with Firefly, but made it more about a big pantheon of godly menace, as opposed to more mundane, just against people kinds of things. But I think that would kind of get the vibe for it for sure. I mentioned in the intro that there are guns and there are airships in this.
Mhm.
So I think that kind of shifts the subgenre a little bit, if you will. So in kind of both pitching it to people when you talk to them about it, but also when you were talking to editors and the publisher about it and talking to them, where did you kind of, I mean, do you just go in and like, it's epic fantasy with some stuff? Or do you like, well, it's a little bit steampunky, but not really, it doesn't really have all that stuff, but it's kind of there. And, how does that work?
Yeah. So, like, dirty secret of publishing is you cannot say the word steampunk or no one will buy anything. For whatever reason, it just has never sold well. So that's like, don't ever say steampunk, audience, if you're ever pitching a book. So I usually say it's like flintlock fantasy or like gunpowder fantasy, just to like get the idea that, oh, it's not medieval epic fantasy. It's epic fantasy and more of like a 19th century kind of feel to it.
It certainly isn't people walking around with gear stuck to their hats kind of thing. So
Right.
yeah, flintlock, that makes more sense. I should have had that more on the tip of my tongue, but yeah, I mean, it's that kind of giving people that sense, because some people have that like it's fantasy, so some people default to it must be European fantasy with swords and orcs, and no, it's not that, it's not that kind, but it is a fantasy realm.
Fantastical.
Yeah. I didn't even make the connection until I was reading that script out loud that it was like your last book was The Seventh Queen and this one is The Queen of Days.
I don't know why I did that to myself, but it is a thing that has happened.
Not the same world, not the same, like not remotely. It doesn't feel at all like that duology in any way to me, other than your sense of pacing, which I think that the duology definitely gets up and moves, and this one even more so. I felt like I was already 20% into the book and I blinked and I was like, oh my God, like it just moves so quickly.
Yes.
Thinking about that and knowing that like whether Queen is a running theme for you, but very different types of royalty in this particular case. Do you remember kind of the origin story for this? Do you remember kind of where it came from, like the genesis of the idea?
Yeah, so I have a great love for Dungeons and Dragons. I've been playing probably for about 10 years now. And this was like very loosely based on an adventure one of my parties once had. So in a very like D&D sort of way, we'd all gotten together in this very like Venice type city, and we were trying to rob a bank where this big bad evil guy had stored all of his, illicit goods. And literally from the moment we walked through the door, everything that could have gone wrong did. Like, we got made, we had to run, we got trapped in a room with no doors or windows, we set the building on fire, we had to jump out a window. Like, it was just utter chaos, and it was so much fun. It was just hysterical, and I was thinking about it for days and days afterward, and just thinking, like, if I could find a way to distill this into a story, it would be just bonkers amazing. And so that's kind of what I set out to do with The Queen of Days, was just kind of instill that fun that you get when a bunch of chaotic, neutral people get together and decide they're going to do a thing.
The important question I have to ask is, what class do you play?
I play in several games, but my favorite character, I play an arcane trickster.
Ooh.
Who is an amnesiac. So she's very Harley Quinn.
Oh, wow.
She's like if Harley Quinn was a tiefling.
That's fantastic.
Yeah.
I love everything about that. Please write that. I've been running a D&D game for like 3 years. So my class is really dungeon master, I guess, for the most part, although I tend to play like rangers and sorcerers. But my group refers to themselves as Team We Come in Peace, because they basically, we come in peace and then murder everybody. They're like always trying to go for the peaceful solution. They just can never do it. Nobody ever takes it, right? So,
oh, that's hilarious.
But I do love that idea of like the chaotic neutral party enters a room, everything goes awry.
Yep. It's just like fated. There's just nothing you can do.
I love the D&D game as origin story for novel, because I think it's way more prevalent than people even realize. I mean, going way back into, the 80s and 90s, way back. Certainly they've informed so many. I mean, when I had the writer duo Amy Carrick on the show a while back, they were talking about their novel, and it was the same thing. Like, they had played a D&D game together and they were like, you know what, we should just write that.
It's so good, and it's so hard to like convey how much fun D&D is, because it's like trying to describe a dream to someone. The dream was awesome, but there's no amount of words I could ever use to make you feel as awesome as that dream was. And it's kind of the same is true about like explaining your D&D game to anybody.
I feel like it's trying to tell somebody 15 years of continuity of the X-Men. You can't do it because you sound like an insane person.
Yeah.
Does not make sense. There's no way to sum it up in any way if you're just trying to tell the story. And I feel like D&D is often the same way. So props to actually distilling it into a narrative that makes sense. There is a heist in it. And I always feel like anytime I hear that, I'm like, oh, you did that to yourself, huh? Because that's got to be like the hardest thing to write. I think that the heist is a little deceptive, at least in the pitch here. I won't go into that too much because I want people to kind of see that for themselves. But as both readers and writers and reviewers have gotten more conscious of trope over the years, I'm always curious about when you go into something, like how conscious are you of thinking about, I'm doing found family, or I'm doing a heist, or I'm doing something like that. Like, was that ever in your thought process? Is that something when you're talking to the editor, like, well, I'm playing with this? What was that like for you in this book?
Yeah, well, for sure. And I think it's really obvious off the bat that found family was the one that was most highly on my mind. And I love that trope for so many reasons, but I think it's so evergreen because families can mean so many different things to so many different people. Yes, like the Italian gang, they can be kind of mostly bound by blood, but you know what? They can also be the people who hold the door open while you light the fuse. And that is like awesome. I think like going out and finding your people and your tribe as an adult is one of the great joys of life that doesn't get like sung about enough. So found family was definitely on my mind. Another one that kind of came up while I was writing ended up being the idea of platonic best friends, because the relationship that grows between Val and Tassiel, who is the Queen of Days, was just so pure. I was like, oh no, there will never ever be anything romantic about this, but they are like platonic soulmates. May they be together forever.
I really appreciate when you can get a story that doesn't necessarily force a romance where it doesn't fit, and respects that sometimes your person can just be the friend.
Yeah, I love writing romance. Like, you could see that in the Frozen Crown books, but like that relationship between Tassiel and Val is just chef's kiss.
Well, I made the joke and the first time you were on, that in the Frozen Crown that you had like a hexagonal, like,
I still use that, by the way. That was
good. the hexagonal love, the love hexagonal, whatever it was. Yeah, it was like because there were so many cross the murder board.
The whole Venn diagram. I did a TikTok video about it once. Go find that on my channel.
So yeah, you made it easier on yourself in this one, where at least with those two leads, that's not. I mean, Val has his complicated romantic relationship that fuels a lot of the story as well. But we'll talk about that here in a second. Let's dig into the setting first.
Sure.
Because I think what we start off with here is, you mentioned this, like, the city of canals and kind of flintlock. And, I mentioned that, there is this kind of reverence for the old gods that, like, Bal as a character does not believe in at all. He has a totally secular disbelief kind of at the beginning of the story. So what more can you tell us about this setting, about the world that it inhabits, and how it informs the story for your characters?
Yeah, so unusually for me, I didn't have a whole great grip on the setting until after I had written the first draft of the story. This book was actually a NaNoWriMo book to begin with. So, National Novel Writing Month in November, you try to write 50,000 words in that month, and there's your book. Now, obviously, that doesn't actually make a whole book, but that was my first draft, was basically like 55,000 words. So there wasn't a lot of setting room. Then next spring, I had taken a trip to Italy with some friends, and we happened to go to Venice. And it was like, the gates of heaven opening. I was like, yes, this is it. This is the place where it's going to be. But I wanted it to be, instead of, a city, on the edge of a continent, I wanted it to be an island, because it makes it so much more bound and condensed, and there's not really a good way for them to escape. Because, like I said before, they're chaotic neutral characters. If there was a way for them to have just left, they probably would have.
Right.
And then by that same token, like, if they're by themselves at the very end of this archipelago island chain, reinforcements aren't really coming. So if anyone's going to deal with it, they're just going to have to put on their big girl pants and just do it. And I think it also helps with pacing, is knowing that there's not a lot of space for them to run. There's not a lot of space for them to hide. And it helped me, for at least, to feel like as soon as that inciting incident happened, like, the fuse had been lit, there is no escape. It's going to happen. So you better react, and react fast.
Fantasy is so often sprawling. It's in 8 different locales, and the where the person starts is 1,000 miles on foot, across the continent and or whatever.
Yeah.
So having things that are a little bit more contained, it's not quite like a bottle episode, if you will, but it does, it gives parameters on it, and I do like that. And yeah, like you said, I mean, a good chaotic neutral party could often just be like, and we're out, and you don't get that option here. At least, well, it's presented at one point that they could potentially go more towards the mainland, but there is a threat of the fact that they would pretty much be arrested immediately. Yeah. So they're like, well, we could be safe, but not free. And that isn't necessarily, that's definitely not the chaotic neutral way, right?
Right.
So not going that direction for sure. With the religious structure, so a thing that kind of struck me with it, they have this sort of pantheon of like 7 gods, and then there's sort of like some other kind of things that branch off of it. It struck me as being kind of Greek, kind of an Olympus type of thing. It doesn't share a lot in common with it, but there are certain elements that were kind of that brought that to mind. Was that like an intentional thing? Is that what you were kind of playing with?
Yeah, that's very spot on. In addition to like the D&D angle, one of the things I came to the story thinking about, I think it was like a documentary I had been watching about the Greek city-states, where you had these cities dedicated to individual gods, and then like a different city might be dedicated to a different god. And it just got me thinking, okay, you are a human giving like these vast temples and houses and food and money and virgins or whatever to your knowingly capricious gods. What are you going to do if they physically decide that, yeah, this looks good, I'm going to stay here and live here? Like, that would not be anyone's idea of a good time. So that was definitely one of the seeds of the story. And then you put that in contrast with all of the science and industry that it's already happened in this world. Like many societies after the Enlightenment, belief starts to go downhill. Balthazar does not believe that the gods are actually real, and he's not the only one in the story who really feels that way. So yeah, he was in for a rude awakening.
I feel like the gods are kind of like affluent but annoying in-laws. Like, you want them to send the toys to the kids at Christmas, but you don't want them to come and stay for a long period of time.
And that's at their best. Like, as the story unfolds, you realize, oh, they're really more like just terminally bored immortals from a different plane of existence. And yay, we're playthings now.
One of the members of Talion, the one who's actually not blood related, is like, married into the group, is the one who's like the most religious of them and kind of clings to his like talisman of the one that he follows. And there is something kind of poignant about the fact that he's the guy of faith, and I think it's Janus is the god that is the primary in that pantheon. Not the oldest, but the primary.
The current primary.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Well, because I mean, if we look at any stories of full pantheons of gods, they don't sit well with each other all of the time, and there's some upheaval, and that definitely comes into play here too. But so here he is with his like god that he's praying to, and it's like, oh, but that's the worst one.
Abort.
Right. We've made some errors in judgment here.
Yeah.
I like that as an element because I thought that kind of really brought this interesting dynamic of like the most pious person is praying to the enemy, essentially.
Yeah. Well, it's like you're praying to a god of war. Like, do they really have your best interest at heart? Really?
Safety doesn't really come into the equation at all.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. I want to dig into more about the Talion. We talked a little bit about Balthazar, and I definitely want to dig into the Queen of Days because she's the titular character and pretty fascinating in the way you've developed her out. But before I get into that, one thing I do want to kind of address is the POV structure in the novel.
Yeah.
So specifically, it's because Balthazar is kind of the primary narrator of the book and has a first-person POV through all of his pieces. But we do switch off to Tass and get a third-person perspective. Now, I feel like 10 years ago and before, I would have never seen this structure, like the crossover between two different kinds of POVs. Like, there's a novel that I still have on my shelf that's like a book from like the late 90s that has kind of that, and it felt very jarring in its moment because I'd never read any other book that did that. These days, I encounter it a lot more. I've been seeing it quite a bit lately, and so I always think it's an interesting choice, and I get that there's some big benefits to it, but I think like figuring out how to balance that tone between somebody speaking in their own voice And then a third person narrator that feels true to who they're narrating, but not too jarring with the other narrative is definitely a weird balance to walk. So I want to know why you made that specific choice, how that worked for you, if it created challenges for you during the writing process.
Yeah, so I think it's something that you see more and more nowadays. You see it a lot more with like debut books than you used to in the past. And I think that's specifically because, particularly for new authors, it can be really hard to differentiate voice when you're starting out. So it can be like a shortcut for some writers to like, oh, okay, I know that this character is always going to be in first person and this character is always going to be in third person. That wasn't quite the reason I did it for Tass and Val, because they are so wildly different from each other that I wasn't really worried about voice issues. But there are two main reasons I put her in third person. The first is slightly spoilery, but not really, because she reveals it within like the first 3 chapters. Tass is not human.
Right.
So I wanted to like create a subconscious difference between how she sees and perceives the world as a non-human person compared to how you or I would perceive the things happening to her. And then at the same time, the way Tassiel starts out the story, she's been very isolated for a very long time. She's very stoic and like take things on the chin and just suck it up and move on. And because of that, she is kind of emotionally stunted. So there's a real cavernous, vast difference between what she says and what she actually feels. And so I thought that third person would allow me to play with that a little bit more. Because especially in first person, you're bound to that person. So it's hard to show when they're lying to themselves, or it can be. Whereas if you kind of pull the perspective back a little bit, it was more clear for her in this particular instance to see like, oh, she's saying this one thing, but inside she's like dying a little bit. So those are the reasons I did it. Hopefully it doesn't bother too many people, but I know it probably will irk a couple readers here or there.
First person POV, the immediacy of it, and that character speaking directly to you as the reader is a shortcut is not the right way to phrase it, but it is something that just does create like an immediate connection. It's why we see it so much in YA, because like it's the accessibility is really, really high.
Yeah, it's inherently intimate that way.
Exactly. That's a very good way of putting it. But the problem is that unless they're a very unreliable narrator, keeping some sense of mystery, of some sense of enigma can be difficult. And so, yeah, when you have this completely alien character, if we were like right inside her head, you'd be like, oh, and she just can give away the game. So it's pretty weird being like, half a god. It would kind of mess up the flow a little bit.
Yeah.
Editorially, what's the feedback on that? Like, how much of the back and forth during the drafting process and stuff did they, give you a push and pull on that? Was there any place in there where they're like, we need to work on this, or was there like, were they on board from beginning?
No, they were really on board from the beginning. Part of that, I think, though, is going into publishing, you don't always know how long the lead time is to things. So I had this book, second or third draft was already done before The Frozen Crown was even released. So by the time it actually reached my editor's hands, it was really in pretty good shape. So editorially, there wasn't really a whole lot that needed to be done, except for some of those heist aspects. Those did need to be ironed out a little bit because, like you had mentioned before, it's freaking hard to write a heist. And having that mastermind character who always has like plan A, B, C, D, E, F, and G, but you're in a first person, so you can't let the audience know that they have all these contingencies, but you need for them to know in retrospect that they had those contingencies in place. So that took a little bit more of a workaround, but no, as far as like Tassiel's voice, I think that she's a sneaky one. She's like the sneaky caramel coating of the Italian gang. So it takes a minute to like fully see really what she's bringing to the world and what she actually wants. But once you actually see that, she's like, oh, she's just a perfect little cinnamon roll.
When we talk about the Italian group, and we talked a lot about Bal, but maybe not enough about who he is as a person here. But I think you have to know the rest of the group to understand who he is and why he is that way. Like I said, it made me think kind of of Firefly, but specifically it actually makes me think of the version of Firefly that is Serenity, the film, because when you watch that, you have a group of people that have a lot of baggage with each other and are taking it out on each other pretty often. And in this case, you have Bal and his little sister, who he's super protective of, and the rest of the group. So can you kind of walk us through like who the rest of that party are?
Yeah, so obviously Balthazar is the face man. He's like the con man of the group. And he was originally the oldest child of the former governor of the city. The city, as you probably have imagined by now, is very corrupt. So his family was killed in a very bloody coup, and he had to skip town with what remained of his family. And that ended up being his much younger sister, Mira, his older cousin, Z, his illegitimate half brother Kai, and then later on, Z got married to a disgraced soldier, Edik, and that's the Talion gang. So they're kind of a motley crew. They've all got a bit of a chip on their shoulder for different reasons, but it's always fun to create groups of people and like figuring out whose specialty is going to be what and how they all work together. But yeah, the baggage was real. I wish I could say that like there was a hard and fast rule that you can follow about putting X amount of backstory in Act One and X amount in Act Two, but there's really not. But I think in a way, I mentioned before that this was a NaNoWriMo book, and writing such a Spartan draft kind of helped me figure out where parts needed to be like more here or less here, or, you know, that kind of the balance of a story that's plotted so tightly and quickly. Because if you go all in on the exposition, that's really going to mess up your pacing. So you have to be very, very judicious about what you say when and how you say it. So lots of that baggage ends up getting revealed in the way a character observes a situation, or like a witty one-liner to like what's happening. It's like, oh, okay, they're really bitter about this one thing, but maybe we don't need to know the entire reason why.
In the way that this is plotted and paced, I thought several times that it felt almost screenplay-like rather than epic fantasy-like, you know, where you're overdoing the thing. Because I mean, screenplays have done this forever, but I feel like in publishing there's been a push towards the get as deep into the story as you possibly can before you hit the start button. Essentially, it's like, you know, skip as much of the prologue as possible. Yeah. It's even finding out like years ago that there's a lot of people who skip prologues in novels. They open up and they see prologue and I'm like, I'm not reading that, and they just go straight to chapter one, and I'm like, what? Who does that? Who are these sociopaths?
Well, it's like so ingrained, I think, into publishing now that when writers query, often the advice is don't query with the prologue, query with chapter one.
It's so bizarre to me because like that stuff always matters to me, but at the same time, for a lot of people, they're like, that just slows them down. Can you imagine like reading the Wheel of Time without reading the prologue, right? And be like, what is even happening after this? I don't know. It's very bizarre to me. But anyway, like this is definitely a story where like we're coming in as late as we can. Mm-hmm. Was that there from the beginning in the first like NaNoWriMo draft? Did you kind of you know you were going to start in the cell with we're looking for the Queen of Days, we're going to get her and get this going?
Yeah. So my initial goal with this, because I knew I wanted it to be so fast paced, was like, got to get to that inciting incident, that scene in the temple within the first 50 pages. And I don't think it was actually, by the time the book was written, it's not within the first 50 pages, but it's probably pretty close. But I wanted it to just kick off with a bang, and there to not be many places to catch your breath between the beginning and the end. So yeah, that was very intentional.
There's also something, a choice that I thought was really interesting in this, which was that basically like you have, I'm going to try not to be too spoilerly with this, but I feel like it's hard to talk about it without giving some of it away. But you do have this person that is the object of Bal and his family's ire, like this person that, you know, he wants revenge on, and he wants it as decisively and compulsively as you can, you know, like, you know, this is the thing he needs to do. We meet that guy and he's an asshole, and, you know, you hate him immediately, which is what you should. But he doesn't stick around long as the top of the heap, you know? Yeah. And so again, you know, when I think about like editorial decisions and stuff, like, is that something that they were like, oh, okay, cool. Like, you know, we get to him like really, really quickly and realize that like, he's not going to get this satisfaction from this. This is not a revenge fantasy in that way. That certainly drives Bal, but you're not going to get that like, oh, you got what you wanted and everything's fine now. That's not how that ever works. Did you ever have any worry about that, of like kind of getting to that so quickly and past it?
No, and you know, my like team at Voyager didn't really blink at it either. But I think the reason that it still works is, you're right, this is really hard to talk about without getting too spoiled. Something happens that is very Men in Black 1. Where the man that you're talking about, Governor Posh, still sort of exists, but not in the way that he once did. So then the question for Bal becomes, are you fighting this because you want to save the city, or are you fighting this because you want Posh to suffer more? And so that becomes kind of the internal struggle for Bal of figuring out where his priorities really are. Or is he really willing to risk his family and everyone he loves on revenge, or is he really doing it because he thinks he has a shot of getting everyone out alive and like getting the happily ever after?
You had that very well reasoned, like put together very tightly there. Yeah, I think that like when we get revenge narratives, and a thing that I often have trouble with when I read or watch movies that are driven by things like this is how much it depends on the immediacy of things. Like if you take like, let's say the biggest one out there is like sort of like Batman. Not that revenge is his thing, but it's like something happens when he's like 7 years old and he's a man in his 30s still driven by that one singular inciting incident.
Right.
And I feel like most people get over things, at least consciously. Subconsciously, we never get over anything, right? Like that's why we're all in therapy, right? Like that like later on we're like, that person said something mean to me when I was 9 and I've never let go of it, right? But in general, like that need to cling to a thing and making it, is such a aspect of fiction that characters hold on to a thing and it drives their entire being. Now, when somebody kills your entire family, throws away your entire heritage and completely ruins your life, and it's within kind of your range of adulthood, I feel like that is a more acceptable and believable thing. Versus I could see like Mira being like, I don't know, man, that happened when I was like 5 and let's just do something else, right?
Right.
Which I think would still also be an acceptable, understandable way to handle things.
It's also like one of the things that makes Bal and Tassiel's relationship, I think, work. Like one of their big bonding moments was, after all this bad stuff had happened, they have kind of like a minute to just sit and talk. And she reveals that her people are physically incapable of forgetting anything. Like they remember every single moment that has ever happened to them exactly as if it had happened at this very moment in time. And so she basically says to him, like, you think that you are clinging on to your anger and your memories are crystal clear, but you're not. Your memory is full of ghosts, so why are you letting them haunt you? Because, you're doing it to yourself. You think Posh really cares about what Balthazar was doing? No.
We all create kind of our own narratives in our head, and sometimes we tell a story to ourselves over and over again until we believe it, and that can really affect us. So I mean, the burden of remembering everything crystal clear is awful. Yeah. So it gives her a perspective on that I think is really interesting, that is both like born of, oh, I know that you humans have this weird fleeting existence and you think that this is important, but I remember it for real, and trust me, it gets weirder than this.
Tip of the iceberg, dude.
Yeah. I feel like if we dig too much more into this, we're going to give away way, like, people are going to be like, oh, that was the whole novel. Cool. Well, believe me, if you're listening to this is a third of it. There's way more past all of this. Because I'd love to dig into the time eating part of it and all that, but I actually think that that's better discovered in the text. You can make your guess as what it is if you're listening to this, but that is part of it. But I want to dig more now into the last few years for you, because we did talk at the end of 2020. Your first book came out in 2021, and the first 2 books came out in 2020, right?
Yeah, January and November.
This like 8-month release or whatever, 10 months, I guess. And there's been a big push for that in publishing, as far as getting series like trilogies and duologies and stuff out as quickly as possible, because the momentum is important. Readers may be reluctant to pick up a trilogy if not all the books are out yet. Right. There's that fear that things won't complete, that they disappear, and that happens more often than we'd like to see for a lot of different reasons. So you cranked out the duology. You said this book was basically done when you were putting those out. So this one's been kind of hanging around waiting for its turn. Not knowing that going into this, I was thinking, okay, you wrote these 2 books and then you did this one. Well, actually, the order is kind of all over the place. So I want to know what it's been like for you going from debut author in 2021 to getting 2 books out, getting the 3rd one out now. You have a show, the Critters and Knitters, or is it Knitters and Critters?
Knitters and Critters, yeah.
Knitters and Critters. That's about knitting and Critical Role. So you're doing this other thing alongside of it. When we talked the first time, you were really short span away from having a child. Yeah. That's not a small thing at all.
I was a live grenade, seriously. One wrong move and this baby was coming out.
So yeah, that's a whole lot to pack into a few years that also included a pandemic and a complete shift in the publishing landscape and all that stuff. So, I mean, what can you tell me about all of that, this experience going from debut author to, I don't know what it counts as when you're a third book author that's not part of a trilogy. So it's a new thing. I don't know. But what's it all been like? What's that experience been like for you?
Honestly, it feels like debuting all over again. Like the first two books came out during the pandemic. So, January 2021 and then November 2021. Real rough to have first books coming out. It was terrible. But publishing was still trying to figure out how to market and sell books at that point in time. And then you had a bunch of new writers like me who were trying to figure out how to market and sell books. And is there anything we can do that is actually going to push the needle forward? Jury's out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But yeah, it was a lot. And I was at that point in time still really new to social media. Like you said, I was just about to have a baby and I had an almost 1-year-old at that point in time because, again, why not do all the things at once? So I just remember it being really crazy. Yeah, so my second daughter was actually born the day after The Frozen Crown came out, which, as you can imagine, is the perfect time to have a new child.
Oh my gosh.
So it was just like a blur of exhaustion, but it's still in like a really like fun and exciting way. It was weird though with publishing, with like the publishing aspect of the second book coming out after like lockdowns had eased and more people were starting to come out in the world. Is it felt like my publisher saved all the launch events for that second book, which is unusual. Usually they would, start with the first book and then try to build momentum to the second book. And for that and many other reasons, it's not all on my publisher. The Frozen Crown books really did kind of struggle to find their audience, which is always a bummer. I love those books. I will always love those books. But there's really no point, at least in my mind, to kind of look back and agonize over all the things I could have done or, all the things that this author got that I didn't. It's pointless. It's not healthy. To paraphrase Kierkegaard, there's no state of being more agonizing than remembering a life you didn't live. I really try to think about that. Like, it's in the past. I love those books. I love it when people find those books. But it does kind of feel like The Queen of Days is my second chance at debuting because, life is kind of sort of back to normal and we can do in-person events. And I feel like that's where I do best, which is like connecting with readers and finding other, nerdy fans is at conferences or at book events. So I'm really excited to be doing that with The Queen of Days.
My hope is that, what we have seen sometimes is that we've had people who've kind of lived in the mid-list for a long time until something's blown up. Yeah. And then when that happens, the backlog tends to start picking up a lot. Like we're sort of seeing that with like Martha Wells because of her Murderbot series, because she had been, a terrific fantasy writer that just had not found a big audience for a long time. And then Murderbot became the biggest thing in sci-fi.
Right.
and deservedly so. And so that's led to re-releases of previous books and stuff, or say like a Hugh Howey that did the Silo books, the Silo books blew up, but now that it's an adapted series, he's getting more sales off of all that stuff. But it does feel like a weird thing in the publishing world because, we do see is that you double down on what's already popular, right? And which is frustrating every time I walk into a store and see shelves of books that have already sold a bazillion copies and be like, it's cool that people love The Name of the Wind, but does it really need to be on a featured shelf in the front of My Books a Million? Not really, man. Like people have already found this book over and over again, right. And with no disrespect to Patrick and whenever he eventually finishes that series, which, I may be in my dotage.
Yeah, I will still buy the hell out of that third book whenever it comes out.
Sure, yeah. It's like seeing The Lord of the Rings up on shelves. I'm like, I know it's there because it perennially sells, but that doesn't do any good for the rest of the publishing industry. Yeah. And I get very frustrated with that. And there's also like, there was that push for a while where like everybody had to have a big social media followings because like, that's how you're going to sell your books. Like, that doesn't sell books.
Yeah, that's the lie authors tell themselves to have like any kind of control over their sales.
It just most of the time doesn't translate into sales in that way. So, and it's a complicated landscape. There's more writers than ever. The indie world is a whole thing as well. The shelves are flooded with stuff. And so trying to find a niche, find the audience, and it can take a little while. And it's the same thing being a podcaster, like, hoping that you just find enough people that love what you do to help you sustain it. And so that, when you're looking at the numbers, whether it's sales or listens or whatever, you're like, okay, this is still worth it because I'm getting to an audience, right?
Right.
Debuting in the middle of that mess, when you think it should have been easier to sell books than ever, in the sense that like people were at home with nothing to do.
Yeah.
I think about right now, like as we're talking, the writer's strike has been going on for like 60 days or something longer. The SAG-AFTRA just went on strike. And so movies and TV are probably going to grind to a halt for a long stretch. Yeah. And deservedly so, because screw those studios and the way they treat the people who actually make the things that make them money.
Right.
Yeah, I was talking with my wife about it last night, where I was like, this is the time, put books in people's hands. Like, they're going to run out of TV shows to watch, even though there's, infinite amounts of stuff that's out there. But still, like, if somebody was like, what are we going to do without all those films? I would turn to the massive wall of books behind me and be like, I'm good, fam.
Yeah. I've got this.
We're good. We're solid. There's plenty to do. The library is open.
It's just changing so rapidly, between everything that happened in the pandemic and now, like, everything that's happening with AI and what do we own and how can we protect our works? And there's just so many questions in the air that I think the next few years are going to be really interesting for creatives in all aspects of media.
Yeah, and I think the question that I expect, like, a lot of publishers to be talking now is saying, oh, well, how do we get this on TikTok? Because when I walk into my local store, there's literally 5 shelves that just say hot on TikTok. And I'm like, oh my God. I have such a weird feeling about it, because on one level I'm stoked because it means that people are passionate about books and talking about them a lot. And when they talk about it, it drives sales. That's amazing. But some of those books suck. Yeah. And it's really frustrating sometimes. I mean, that sounds like such a callous, awful thing to say, but it's like there are a lot of like half-baked things getting pushed out into the market because the person who's making it has a following that they think they can exploit or something. And there's a lot of times where I've gotten books passed my way where they're like, oh, check this out. This is so hot on whatever. And I'll read into it and be like, this wasn't done. We need to put this back in the oven, right?
Right. This is a 3rd draft. I'd like to see the 9th.
Right, exactly. I've often said, both this on the show and in conversation with people, that like nothing makes me madder than a thing that could have been great but falls short of being good.
Yeah.
And so when I read a book that it's like almost there to being fantastic but doesn't land, and I'm not mad at the author then, I'm usually mad at the publisher and the editorial, because I'm like, we could have got there. It just took a little bit more. But I know publishing moves faster these days, and there's that need to get things done. But yeah, I don't know. It's tough. I'm way off track there. But I'm going to swing back around. We're talking about your journey and all this. Last time we talked, you mentioned that that you were using like 7-point structure, essentially like the Dan Wells method.
Yeah.
Is that still what you're using today? How much has the writing changed? I'm assuming you're working on the next thing now. So what does writing look like now post all this other stuff?
Yeah. So I still do use that 7-point plot structure. Something about it just like makes my linear little brain very happy. I think part of it is because I always know where I want my story to end. And I usually have like the inciting incident in mind, but I don't always know where the middle is going to take me. And one of the nice things about that particular method is it's very easy to start with the end and work your way backwards to try to figure out logically what chain of events needs to happen. And so I still use that method. And I've taken that NaNoWriMo idea of writing very short first drafts and then building on top of those. For me, as a writer, plot usually comes easier for me than emotional arcs. So it's easier for me to like, okay, I'll just get all of the plot on the page and then figure out what works in the context of what each character is going through and what their journey is. Yeah, I'm much more of a writer who flourishes in editorial than I do on that first draft. So you just got to lean into your strength, I think.
That's so weird for me, because for you to say that you're plot oriented and the emotional side is harder, because your books are drenched in emotional conflict and in characters that are very emotionally driven in a lot of ways. I mean, certainly Balthazar in this book is all feels, right? Like the sense isn't part of the deal. Like he is driven by all of these things he's experiencing. So that's kind of surprises me that you are plot first in that way.
Yeah. As you can probably imagine, with my first name being Greta, I am very German. And we always joke that we're Germans. We prefer to categorize and analyze emotion rather than feel them. So that's what I bring to writing.
That's what you want to blame it on. That's fine, Greta. But now, there was something that drove me into a panic the last time we talked as well,
Okay.
Which was that when I asked you what you wrote in, you told me that you wrote those books in Word. And I know that that has been a popular choice for forever and ever, but it's been 3 years since then. And I'm curious as to whether or not you're about to disappoint me further when you tell me how you're continuing to write. So I've girded myself
yeah.
for it.
I am going to disappoint you further. I still use Word. In fact, I've gone even more old school. I don't use OneNote anymore. I use actual paper journals and note cards. But in my defense, when I was in Italy, I did find this little like bookbinder that bound actual custom made journals. So I was like, okay, well, this is meant to be. But yes, I do have a wall right over here. Now I'm pointing like the listeners can see this. That is full of note cards where I've plotted out a story I'm working on right now.
That's exactly what I was going to ask, because I was going to say, like, if we were putting alt text to the image they can't see, you are sitting in front of a very neat set of books, beautiful bookshelf, well designed. You've got another shelf to the side that has a bunch of your books on it, a big poster of the Frozen Crown. It's like, this is all clean and nice and beautiful. I'm like,
just hiding the madness.
I was like, okay, the crazy's off to the side. Okay.
The murder wall is stage right.
I love a good murder wall. I'm all about that. The switch to analog, I think, in a digital age, it changes how you do things, and it lets you think a different way. I don't know. There's something that works around with our hardwiring that I think can be really interesting.
For sure. And I even will print out my stories periodically between drafts and just read them on hard copy, because it's just the way my brain takes in information. It's the same reason before I finish a story, I'll read it completely out loud, just in my own voice. So that way I can hear like the musicality inherent in language and make sure that it's like conveying everything that I want it to convey.
It's one of the things I like about if you have a writer's group that reads out loud to each other, because particularly with dialogue, but also just the sense of the way the language works, you find out when you read something out loud and when you see other people react to it, how things land, if the turn of phrase works, if things make sense, especially thinking about how much people consume books in audiobook these days. The way that something sings when you hear it out loud can really change the feel of it. And it can tell you if your dialogue sounds really lame, or if, turns of phrase don't work, or if characters sound the same or something like that.
Or you didn't realize you were using the same word 4 times in one paragraph.
So that is a massive pet peeve for me. And it is something that, unfortunately, over like the last few years, I've noticed a bunch of books that when they get into like their third act, where I can start feeling things get a little rushed, and they're, and I'll start picking out where somebody has leaned into a word too often. And now I'm terrified of it in my own writing, of like, oh no, am I going to fall in love with a phrase and use it too often? Because there's tons of books on my shelf where I could pull it off right now and be like, okay, this is the book that uses shattered too much. This is the book that uses glint too often. And that if you did a word find in there, it'd be like 38 results.
I had that fear with the Frozen Crown. For whatever reason, it must have been like a word of the day calendar, but the word susurrus was just something that was on my mind. So I think at one point I did do like a Control F, like, all right, you get 2 of these, lady. Use them well.
I'm certainly guilty of it just in speech, that if there's a word that emerges, for whatever reason, one day I said the word nebulous. And then after that, it just crept into my dialogue 3 times a day. I was starting to get a complex about it. And then it became ineffable. Normal people don't know what that word even means. Like, how am I using this in daily conversation? So yeah, and it can be so much worse in writing, but at least you can do find and replace and figure out what those things are at. So that part is good.
See, word isn't all bad.
Until it crashes and loses your whole book after 110,000 words.
About that.
What's next on the horizon? What do you do? Like, obviously, like as we're talking about this book is coming out in October. So, and we're talking in July, which is the time to be like, hey, if you're waiting to get the next book, buy the other 2 first, read up on those, and then get a whole new series in October. Please do that now. And by please, I mean just do it.
Do it.
Yeah. But yeah, so you've got some time before I mean, obviously you're on the promotional campaign, but I'm going to assume that there's going to be a bunch of promo stuff going on with it. So what's that going to be like? What promotional stuff are you doing? What are you working on now? I'm sure you can't talk about too much, but give us a hint.
Yeah. So of course there is another fantasy book in the works. This one's got a little bit of a mystery flair. It's a little bit Addie LaRue, a little bit Caraval, lots of fun. But hopefully I'll be able to talk about that sooner rather than later. We'll see. We're hoping it finds a home. But in the meantime, I do have lots of promotional stuff coming up for the Queen of Days. I'll be at Gen Con this year, so anyone who's going to go and be a nerd, come find me there. And I'm also planning on going to Rose City Comic Con in Portland this year, which I'm very excited about. Like you mentioned before, I also have a YouTube channel, Knitters and Critters, so if you love Dungeons and Dragons or making stuff, knitting, crocheting, or just sewing, whatever, come find me. It's my friend Claudia and I run that channel, and we do lots of make-alongs, and we talk way too much about Critical Role, but I just love that show.
I will admit that I've never seen it.
Oh no.
No, and really for me, it's a weird thing that in the age of Twitch and stuff like that, where a lot of people like tuning into other people playing and doing a thing, I just can't do it. I want to do the thing, but I can't necessarily play or watch somebody else do it.
Normally I'm that way too, but I think it's different because they're actual character, like voice actors who play the role, so they get really into it. But a good entry point to it might be the show Vox Machina on Amazon. It's adapted from one of their games. I
did watch the first 3 episodes of that, and I was struck by how true it was to the sort of D&D experience as far as how parties work and all that. I feel like between that and the actual D&D movie, which was rad.
So good.
It actually really nailed all of the feel and fun of everything it associated with the Dungeons and Dragons experience. So I've toyed with the idea before of maybe someday I should just run an all author D&D campaign.
Do it.
But then I was like, but that's terrifying from the standpoint of the DM, because I'm like, oh, I'm going to run it for a bunch of people who understand world building, might hold me to having a cohesive plot. They're going to point out whenever I have I've retconned something, or when I'm 2 years in and they're like, no, I've been tracking all this. And you said in the 3rd session, this thing, and now you need to be held to it. I'm like, oh God, that would be a nightmare. But a good challenge. It'd be fun.
I don't think so. I'm always, my DM's when are you going to run your game? And I'm like, never. Because I'm too much of a control freak, and the moment y'all go off script, which is half the point of Dungeons and Dragons, I would just freeze.
I think for me, that's where I was a theater kid. I was a part of an improv group when I was in high school, which is kind of a scary thing to say out loud as an adult. But I think it informs that part of things, the kind of running and playing with stuff, and I like doing voices and stuff too. So the DM experience is a lot of fun. But yeah, it can be tough whenever you're there is a rail. You can find it. Just go with the rail. It'll be easier. Not that I want it to be on a rail, but yeah. This is turning into a D&D podcast. We should do that as a separate thing. So yeah, okay. So as we wrap up, obviously Knitters and Critters, you said that's on the YouTubes. Yep. In the day and age of social media destruction, considering Twitter's on fire, Blue Sky's kind of neat, except for it's got a big problem in it. I don't know if you're on the Blue Sky yet.
No, I'm not.
It was really nice for a little while, but now of course all the problems are emerging on it. They're all a mess. Threads just appeared. That's awful. So anyway, I primarily keep up with your stuff on Instagram. Yeah. Where should people be looking for you? What's the website, the handles, all that?
I'm mostly on Instagram. I am still on Twitter, just waiting for the heat death of that site to occur. But I'm delaying my entry into any of the other ones because I'm why? I am on TikTok, so if you want to hear me ramble about Critical Role or writing tips, you can go find me over there. I also write for an entertainment site called Pure Fandom, so if you want to catch up with any other nerdy stuff I'm doing, you can check that out as well. So I keep busy.
Yeah, notably, yes. Okay, that's an awful lot. Well, Greta, it was a pleasure having you back on again. I hope people check out this book. Like I said at the top, The Queen of Days is coming out October 24th from Harper Voyager. I will hammer them over the head again with the fact that the Warrior Witch duology is available and on your shelves now. So the Frozen Crown and the Seventh Queen are there. I saw them in my local bookstore when I was in last week. I know they're on the shelves. Go buy them. Or get them in all the different places. Those are terrific novels, just completely different from this one, which I love. I love when, even though you're staying in fantasy, that you're telling very different stories, and I think that's great. So I'll be looking forward to seeing what you do after this. Hopefully people check this book out. And Greta, thank you so much for joining me again on Fictitious.
Thank you so much for having me. This was a blast.
Links to buy all of Greta Kelly's books are in the show notes. I use affiliate links, so purchasing through those supports my work on this program, but I always encourage you to shop your local indie bookstores whenever possible. Every episode of Fictitious is available on my website, fictitiouspodcast.com, along with more info about the books and authors and all the relevant links to follow and support them. I've also just launched a new site called Fictions and Fandoms, which is a sort of companion to this podcast. Where Fictitious is focused on authors and writing, Fictions and Fandoms is a reader-centric book news, reviews, and commentary site. The goal there is to provide thoughtful examination of genre fiction and to explore the fandoms and culture around it. The site is in its early stages, but there's already a lot of content there, and expect the types of articles and features to evolve over time. Check it out now at fictionsandfandoms.com. Social media is in a distinctly weird place at the moment, but you can connect with me and the show on Instagram as Fictitious Pod, and now on Blue Sky as @fictitiouspodcast.com. If that handle sounds weird, it's because you can verify your account name on Blue Sky via your website, which is pretty cool. Blue Sky has already become an active hub for the writer crowd, so it's worth checking out if you can score an invite. I'm still on Twitter for the moment, and no, I'm not going to call it whatever Elon's changed it to this week. The account there is @FictitiousPod, but expect that to be updates only for the foreseeable future. Fictitious is available on all the major podcasting platforms, including Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, Google Podcasts, Audible, and Amazon. If you're listening on a platform that allows you to like and subscribe, please do so and leave me a comment about the episode, or consider reviewing or rating the podcast. I actually got a really nice Spotify comment on my last episode, which is not a thing I knew you could even do on Spotify. All of that feedback supports my work on the show and is very much appreciated. Next episode, we'll be doing something a little different. I'll be talking with Pathfinder co-creator James L. Sutter about writing for sci-fi, fantasy, tabletop role-playing games and how the RPG space relates to genre fiction authors. Until then, I'm Adrian Buskey. Thanks for listening to Fictitious.